Hello everyone and welcome to the Funds of Knowledge presentation. My name is Lorin and my colleague Lionell will be also presenting today. So first we're going to talk about the overview of our presentation. First we're going to talk about important ideas from the theory. We're going to talk about Funds of Knowledge theoretical foundations, and then lastly we'll talk about contributions on the Fund of Knowledge, or the Funds of Knowledge rather. So for our first part, which is important ideas from the theory, and I'd like to talk a little bit about some of the information that I found significant for this particular part. And so one thing that I learned is that funds of knowledge can be transmitted from generation to generation, and they're also transmitted through social and kinship networks, and that does appear in the original article by Vélez Ibáñez and Greenberg in 1992. They also talk about the acquisition of funds of knowledge and how it represents a different type of home-based experiential education. So in other words, they're describing how when a child is learning from, say, one of their parents or another relative, that they usually will tell them, like for instance, if they are learning how to repair a type of engine, they will say, okay, well, you have access to this engine, go ahead and figure it out. And so it is different than the type of formalized learning that maybe that the children or persons, young people, are exposed to at school. One thing that is also present on page 64 of the Vélez Ibáñez and Greenberg article is a discussion about how English-only policy ruptures the connection between Spanish literate parents and English literate children. And in that way, it hinders and fractures, I believe is the word that they use, literacy abilities for children and parents. And then in one of the later articles that we read in Moll et al. From 1992 and also Gonzalez et al. In 1995, there is a discussion of teachers becoming researchers or taking an ethnographic stance and going to visit the students' families so that way they can apply what they learn about the students' funds of knowledge and their families' funds of knowledge to prepare and plan and incorporate within their practice in the classroom.
So a few ideas that stood out to me on the funds of knowledge. So first and foremost, that the funds of knowledge is not necessarily equally distributed. So this means that the people in power continue to gain more of the funds in comparison to the marginalized who do not get the funds. So marginalized could be the low SES, people of color, and while middle to upper class, so white get more funding, and so they are able to thrive within society. Another idea that stood out to me is that the funds of knowledge is ever changing. It is shaped by events and circumstances that one faces. So one of the things that really stood out to me when I was reading this, that this ever-changing idea of the funds of knowledge goes from the micro to the macro. And so looking at it at their home life, looking at it from their school life, looking at it from politically in the United States, and how those events and circumstances at home, at school, and in the United States starts building this change. And so the funds of knowledge is basically based off of the student's life at home. And so their social political context of the local school, how their family interacts with one another, if they have just like a mom, the dad, and the siblings within that household, or if their grandparents or their extended family are in that household. Also, it starts building this change in how these students interact with one another at the home, in the school, goes back in how they are going to interact with people in the United States.
So in the second part, we're going to talk about the funds of knowledge theoretical foundations.
So there are two things that I want to talk about for the funds of knowledge theoretical foundation. So the first one is the definition of culture, and the second thing is the problems that come with the term culture. This is why I believe that the authors change from culture to the funds of knowledge. So first and foremost, the history of the term culture has changed multiple times and changed the idea of culture. So now the definition of culture is the progressive accumulation of characteristics, manifestations of human characteristics in art, science, and knowledge. And so that is really broad definition, looks at art, looks at science, and looks at knowledge in general. So that could mean how we interact with one another, how you form your thoughts, how everything is based off of one another. So this definition of culture is ever encompassing. With that, there are multiple problems that come with it. So the first problem is that there is cultural deficits. And so one culture, one person might say, hey, my culture is better than yours. And so it starts building that deficit. And so with that also, there is this hierarchy of a culture where one group thinks that they are better than the other. So I believe the term funds of knowledge was created to combat this idea of hierarchy and better than other.
So the funds of knowledge concept was originated by Vélez Ibáñez and Greenberg in 1990. And Vélez Ibáñez and Greenberg were anthropologists. They were studying reciprocal social networks among Mexican Americans on the US-Mexico border. Funds of knowledge was also developed and mentioned by Moll et al. In 1992. And Louis Moll was an education researcher. He related the concept of funds of knowledge to Vygotsky's theory of mediation and zone-proximal learning. Also, according to Otten in 2010, the funds of knowledge concept also appears to bear some similarity to Bergeron's conception of cultural capital. So our last chapter or part of our presentation is the contributions on the funds of knowledge.
While I was reading this text, there are two ideas that the funds of knowledge does start to combat. So the first one is it combats a deficit expectation model where there is the belief that the underserved student works harder, they would be able to achieve greater aspects in life. And the other idea that the funds of knowledge does combat is the cultural deficit theory. And so this is the belief that the minority group or the people that do not have power are differentiated because of their culture is seen as a deficit in comparison to the people that are in power. And so within these two models, the expectation model and the cultural deficit theory, it starts looking at whoever has the power controls the culture and how everything should look, and the people who do not have power are put to the side and looked at less than. And so within the funds of theory or within the funds of knowledge, I started noticing a lot of ideas that power controls everything. And with the funds of knowledge, it starts creating an individual's identity through their culture.
So as Lionel mentioned, the funds of knowledge concept does combat the deficit expectation model. And so I'd like to add that funds of knowledge also is a departure from stigmatizing the culture of minoritized students. And some of the examples that we see in our readings are the culture of poverty. There's also the previous work of John Obu and Paul Willis that relate student culture to academic achievement. So one of the other articles that we read in our readings, I believe it's chapter 4 and 5, discuss the teacher ethnographer or teacher research approach, and that is using the funds of knowledge as a tool for teachers to learn more about their students and their family, and then to take the knowledge that they have learned from their home visits and incorporate it in their teaching practice. And here's a list of the references that we consulted in the preparation of our presentation. I'd like to thank everyone for their attention, and hopefully you enjoyed our presentation. And also, y'all take care and talk to y'all later. See you on the discussion boards. Bye, everybody.